There we go. Well, I want to welcome everybody to another edition of Public Leadership Institute's online training series. This particular session, we're going to delve into the topic of well, the national topic of the day. I mean, I don't think you can pick up a newspaper today and not hear a reference to it. We're going to be talking about particularly the impacts as it relates to Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, how it relates to us, how it relates to our respective communities, and be able to have and how we talk about it moving forward. My name is Dave Woodward. I am the National Network Director with Public Leadership Institute. I'm also a local county official and state legislator, and have the honor of being your host today as I get ready to introduce introduce our guest in just a moment. But before I cover a couple of housekeeping matters as we talk about this important topic. A little bit of background: if this is the first time you're joining one of our sessions, the Public Leadership Institute is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and leadership think tank that's really focused about bringing attention around key issues of equity and justice, and working with public leaders to improve their abilities in advancing economic and social conditions for all people. And this topic today is definitely related to that. You can get a lot of information about what we do and publications that we put out there and training opportunities that exist by going to www.publicleadershipinstitute.org. There are a host of publications that, I don't know what's going on the screen here, but I don't know, what's the screen just messed up here. Our Voice and Our Values publication, which is a communication tool for policymakers. We have a playbook on abortion rights, which is a number of policies that you can advance at the state and local level to protect reproductive freedom across this country. The Progressive Agenda that outlines a host of individual issues, and our newest publication, Preparing to Win, a guide for successful advocacy for community-based groups and policymakers to push an agenda effectively. All of those publications are available at our website, publicleadershipinstitute.org. I encourage you to go to them after the session and draw on those resources to help support the work that you're doing. And just like that, it self-corrects itself. So there are the publications. Again, they're all downloadable PDF. If you want hard copies, contact us, or you can go to Amazon and purchase a hard copy of those publications. Just a little housekeeping and kind of how to maximize participation in this session. Like any type of session that we're having, that we want this to be as value-added as possible. To that end, we want you to bring your voice, questions, comments, concerns, experience, feedback, etc. into the conversation. We've got a variety of ways to do that. If you have audio capabilities from where you're joining us at any time during the course of the presentation, you can click on the hand icon and I'll unmute you to ask your questions directly to our panelists and to each other, frankly. I realize that people join us from a variety of places, and sometimes we don't have the ability to maybe ask our question, but you can type it in. So in the question bar, as the presentation is going on, please don't hesitate to type questions in the question bar. We'll try to get through as many questions as we possibly can, so that you get the information you need to be able to put what's about to be presented into action in your community, within your organization, within your work. My email, dwoodward@publicleadershipinstitute.org, is also on the screen there. Feel free to email me during or after the presentation. Probably a little difficult during the presentation, but if there are questions around the topic we're talking about, we'll make sure we get that answer for you after the presentation is done. One other thing that I want to point out, that you should see on your control panel a number of handouts, and our guest is going to kind of talk about those handouts, but you can download them directly from this presentation. After this presentation, we can also send them around as well, but there are a number of handouts, and I'm going to send out a link to an array of even more handouts that are directly related to the information that Frank is going to be presenting today on the topic we're talking about. And to that end, we have Frank Clemente, who's the Executive Director for Americans for Tax Fairness, who without question is the resident expert on fair tax policy, and tax policy that's necessary to protect, expand, and grow the middle class, tax policy that should be designed as progressive rather than regressive. Frank, being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Dave.
Right. And like I said at the top of the presentation here, we're talking about what you need to know about Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, and specifically as it relates to your respective communities. And we hear kind of broad brush summaries out there in some of the news media. We're going to take a deep dive with a kind of comparison analysis of what's at stake here, and hopefully identify pathways for us to be able to engage. So with that, I'm going to, Frank, give you control.
Okay. So show my screen. Click on show my screen.
Yep. If you accept control. There you go. I see your screen, and so you can just play your presentation right green as you normally would, and we can see everything. Yep.
I just go to my PowerPoint.
Just go to your PowerPoint, and then you can go to play.
Probably, okay, so I have my, do you see my PowerPoint?
Yep, I see it in this normal form, so you might want to go to slideshow. And
right.
to hit
how do I view slideshow?
Go to slideshow. Nope, slideshow. Nope, to the right. To the right, to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right.
Oh,
slideshow, click there. Yep, and from beginning. You can, in the upper left-hand corner there. There you go.
Okay.
Play on your screen. See, look at that. That's nice. It's easy.
It's blank right now. Is it supposed to appear?
It should. I don't know.
Oh, there it is. Okay, just came up. Hi, folks. I'm ready to go.
There you go.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me here. And just by way of background, Americans for Tax Fairness is a a coalition of about 400 plus endorsing organizations. About 100 of them are national or so, and others are state-based. It's a collection of groups from the advocacy community, from unions, from think tanks, and many of them I am sure you work with in your various state government associations. So, and we're leading the fight here in Washington against the GOP Trump tax plan. And unfortunately, things have really accelerated, so this is a very timely call. So let's just go into what's at stake. Obviously, everything we care about now, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education, and more. Anything we care about in the future, if we care about making sure folks have health care, if we want to be able to finance a universal pre-K program or have a federally funded child care program or make college affordable for kids, or now, first and foremost, probably getting our infrastructure rebuilt. It all depends on federal revenue, and that's all at stake in this tax fight. If you care about reducing inequality, of course, that is clearly at stake. Both the more tax for corporations and for the wealthy, the more income flows to the top, and the less there is then available for public services, which help bring up the standard of living for folks at the bottom or in the middle. So lastly, defeating tax cuts. This is the #1 priority of our opponents. They have made it very clear they're moving so quickly on this tax legislation here in Washington because they are extremely afraid that everything is at stake for them if this thing goes down. They have not been able to get anything passed this year other than getting Gorsuch approved at Supreme Court. No major legislation has moved. They know if they can't get the tax bill passed, no major legislation will move next year. Forget an infrastructure bill as well. And they have basically said their future as a party, in terms of their majorities in the House and the Senate, are on the line next year if they fail on tax cuts. So a lot is at stake for our side of this. I'm going to run through some background to a sense of what's in the plan, the Trump GOP plan, and some of it you've probably heard. A lot of our analysis is based on the tax framework that they released back in July. It was not a super detailed framework, but it provided enough that the Tax Policy Center, which is a nonpartisan authoritative group here in Washington, it's kind of the gold standard for our side, outside of the Congressional Budget Office. They put a major report out that was quite critical. In language it wasn't critical, but the data was very critical of how the tax cuts were distributed to the upper income. And then another group that you're probably familiar with, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, they do a lot of state-based analysis. They also put a report out, and some of our stuff here depends on their work as well. First thing is that from a language point of view, we're not saying that this is tax reform. We're saying these are massive tax cuts for the wealthy corporations that jeopardize Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and education. So really important to not use the word tax reform here. Tax reform is when you change the tax system, but you don't lose any money. Here they're losing a lot of money. The tax cuts that they're making are worth probably about $5 trillion. You don't really see that in the media, but some folks see it, and I've sort of told them if you add up the changes on the corporate tax side and you add up the changes on the individual side, it's $5 to $6 trillion. A lot of them on the individual side are actually paid for by things like ending the state and local tax deduction, or by getting rid of the personal exemption. In the end, they have $2.6 trillion in corporate tax cuts in this plan, as analyzed by the Tax Policy Center. Those are not paid for. Essentially, it's not paid for. They close very few corporate loopholes and business loopholes in order to pay for their tax cuts. So it's essentially it's a giveaway to them. At least on the individual side, they've changed things. The way I like to say it is, on the individual side, they've closed deductions and benefits that quite a bit benefit the middle class. So the middle class, especially the upper middle class, is going to be paying a fair bit more, and the rich are going to be paying a heck of a lot less. The budget bill that just passed and is actually going to be voted on in the House this week, that calls for the tax plan losing $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's the number you're probably seeing bandied about. That's money that is added to the deficit. It doesn't amount. It's not all the tax cuts. It's just what's added to the deficit. Their theory is going to be that they're going to pay for some of the $5 or $6 trillion in tax cuts by closing loopholes and getting rid of deductions, et cetera, and that there will be a whole bunch of spending cuts in there as well to help pay for their tax cuts. The Tax Policy Center says, the plan that they put forward actually loses $2.4 trillion, not $1.5 trillion. So they've got a lot of squaring of numbers that they need to do. And lastly, the point is that the 1.5 or the 2.4, whatever the number is, that is what is going to have to be raised. That's the gap that is going to have to they're going to have to close either through increasing taxes on some people or by spending cuts. Their budget, the resolution that they've just passed in the Senate, again passing in the House this week, calls for Medicare cuts of $500 billion, Medicaid cuts of $1 trillion, a whole bunch to education, and a lot more. Basically, most of the $5.8 trillion in their Senate budget resolution is coming from the kinds of services that you all depend on. As you know, most state and local governments, about a third of your revenue is coming from the federal government. So just to give you a little sense of some of the priorities that were in the tax plan, which is on the left, and some of the spending priorities that are in the Senate budget resolution on the right. The $2.4 trillion is the total cost of the GOP's unpaid for tax cuts, and we compare that to the $5.8 trillion in total spending cuts that their budget proposes. So 2.4 versus 5.8. On the $2 trillion, there's a corporate tax rate cut that's $2 trillion. There's other additional corporate tax cuts, but the rate cut is $2 trillion, and we're comparing that to the $1.3 trillion that's in their budget on cuts to Medicaid and other health care services. There's you hear a lot about they're offering a small business tax cut. What that is it's a tax. You probably are familiar with what pass-through entities are. They're sole proprietorships, S corporations, partnerships. They are proposing to slash the tax rate on those from the current. The tax rate for them follows the individual tax rates. The top rate on those is 39.6%. They're proposing to cut it to 25%. That loses you $770 billion. And virtually all those tax breaks are going for the top 1%. And to folks like hedge fund managers, corporate lawyers, and real estate moguls, that's equivalent or close to, it's a little bit more than the $653 billion in cuts they propose in income security programs for low-income families. And then they've also proposed repealing the alternative minimum tax, which largely hits the wealthy. That's close to equivalent to the $473 billion in cuts to Medicare. So that just gives you some sense of the kind of trade-offs that are involved in this plan. And this is another way to look at it. We put this together shortly after the hurricane hit Texas, when the estimate was $180 billion. My guess is it's probably higher than that now. It's about a month old. But back then, we compared it to what some of the corporations owe that have profits offshore that have not yet been taxed, but they actually have told the federal government this is how much they would owe if they brought the money back. Apple literally says it owes $72 billion on its offshore money. Microsoft $40 billion. So you get a picture of how much is at stake. These companies just said that they owe $225 billion. If you take what these 56 companies report that they owe, and you make the same assumptions for all the $2.6 trillion in profits that are offshore, they owe $750 billion in profits. If we were to make them bring that money back and pay the official corporate tax rate. So that's a huge investment pool, obviously. So the tax plan is obviously a windfall for the richest 1%. They get 53% of the total tax cuts in 2018, but after 10 years, it climbs to 80%. Literally 8 out of $10 in tax breaks that are in this bill are going to go to the richest 1% of Americans. That's people who make $770,000 a year or more. Their tax cut translates to $129,000 in 2018, but climbs to $207,000 after 10 years. And middle-class families, just for comparison, they'll get about $660 billion in 2018, so maybe $2 a day for coffee, and $420 after 10 years, so essentially $1 a day, which if you think about it that way, doesn't amount to too much. Now, beat the drum. This is a very core message for us in winning this tax battle. We've got to talk hard about how this is a tax increase on the middle class. We'll be putting some paper out this week about that. While the wealthier corporations are getting massive tax cuts, many middle-class Americans will pay higher taxes. The Tax Policy Center estimates that 3 out of 10 middle-class families, that's folks making between $50,000 and $150,000 a year, will pay more taxes under the tax plan in the 10th year. It starts out, it's about 15%. In 2018, it climbs to about 30% in 10 years. Families earning between $55,000 and $93,000, they will owe about $1,300 more in taxes on average, and those making from $93,000 to $155,000, they'll owe $2,500 more in taxes. The middle class loses the SALT deduction. I am certain you know a lot about the SALT deduction. It raises, by eliminating it, it raises $1.3 trillion. That goes towards helping to pay for the overall tax cuts. And as you know, that it really undermines local public services. Over 1/3 of taxpayers making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year use the SALT deduction, and over half of those making $75,000 to $100,000. People in D.C. have sort of, a lot of the politicians here in D.C. have thought, oh, this is really something that just affects, mostly blue states. But when you see these kinds of numbers, 1/3 of taxpayers in that 50 to 75 range, a half in the 75 to 100 range, that is not just people in blue states and blue districts, it's people in red states as well. Families making $7,500, their federal taxes will jump by $1,800. And SALT deduction repeal makes local taxation more expensive, pressuring localities to cut budgets for services like roads and schools. You all know how that works. So there are some resources that we depend on for this, they. I don't know if this PowerPoint will be available to folks, but these are the resources we use. There's key reports that have been done. These are hyperlinks. The thing that's colored is hyperlinks. So if this PowerPoint gets sent out to people, they can hyperlink to that document. It'll take you to the reports that we've used from NACO and the Tax Policy Center and GFOA. So what's it take to win? Well, first of all, from our point of view, connecting tax cuts to service and priorities we fight for is central. And I'm going to show you a few polling slides from our June poll that will reinforce this for you. Connecting what we call the tax trade-off issue, that is critical, and the tax fairness issue. Tax fairness issues, which has to do with who's getting most of the tax breaks, and the 1%. And corporations, that appeals to folks more in the middle, interestingly enough, than the budget trade-offs or the cuts to services does. Those folks who are swing voters, independent voters in the middle, they're more sensitive to spending more government money. They're more comfortable spending more government money, but they're very comfortable with the tax fairness arguments. So we work on both fairness and cuts to services, which is why we say it's tax cuts for the rich and wealthy corporations. It's not tax reform. We win by mass mobilization, state and local level. We are trying to move from the organizations that have mobilized enormously around the Affordable Care Act fight, and I think everybody recognizes it was the grassroots fight that really helped prevail on the ACA fight. We were trying to shift everybody over from that fight to the tax fight, because the tax fight is essentially a healthcare fight as well, given how much Medicare and Medicaid are at stake. We'll talk a little bit more about what's going to start happening next week. Obviously, we need to keep working closely with our allies in Congress, and we just need to very clearly define what side our opponents are on to win in this thing. They have some challenges. Everybody thinks, oh, yeah, they're all, now I will admit, they're showing a lot more unity on this than they have shown all year, and they've shown for the last 4 or 5 years in the House. That's a problem for us. There's no question about it. The reason they're showing so much unity is they're freaking out and desperate. And so, it's a new challenge for us. However, they know what the polls say, and if you actually look at the language they've used in a lot of their talking points, it reflects that the Americans do not support their agenda. That's why they're saying, oh, it's a big tax break for the middle class. They talk about the system being rigged. They talk about wanting to get rid of special interest tax loopholes, etc. They feel some pressure to pay for their tax cuts. You have Bob Corker from Tennessee, key vote. We need 3 votes in the Senate to block this thing. He basically has said, even though he voted for the budget last week, he has said that he will not vote for a tax cut that's not paid for. Now, whether he's going to stick to that word, we do not know. But a lot of them, some of them feel the pressure. They're concerned about having been deficit hawks, and now they're hypocrites, can be accused of being hypocrites. They feel pressure to make it look like they're paying for these tax cuts. The House, even when they passed their budget, they said they would pay for their tax cuts, but now they're adopting the Senate plan of a $1.5 trillion revenue hole. The fact that the tax plan increases taxes on 30% of middle-class families is a huge thing for us to win. They're working very hard to construct the formal plan that they introduce so that the distribution is not so bad, but it's going to be very hard, given that most of these tax cuts are going to corporations and businesses at the top. It's going to be very hard. Those things almost all go to the richest Americans. They all have these divisions among themselves. Some are deficit hawks, some are hardline tax cutters. And then you have moderates like Susan Collins in Maine and Murkowski in Alaska, people who at least have some sense of, you know, they don't like seeing healthcare slashed. Certainly if we can paint this as a contrast between, oh, you're slashing healthcare in order to pay for tax breaks for the rich, that was a big winning message for us in the Affordable Care Act fight. They actually, in the end, their final bill dropped the tax breaks that they were getting rid of out of embarrassment and because they were being attacked too much on it. So we have some possibility of you know, making some real headway there. And there's big divisions among corporations and among all sorts of players. You know, the state and local governments don't want to get rid of the SALT deduction. That wins over a lot of moderate Republicans. But among corporations, they're all competing for keeping their tax breaks. And they don't want to close the ones they have, even though they want the rates to come down. There's big differences between domestic corporations and multinationals over you know, who's going to pay more. We know that the multinationals have been paying a lot less than the domestics have because they've got all these offshore loopholes that they're able to take advantage of. So there's going to have to be some pain on the multinational side if they're going to raise revenue to pay for some of this stuff. And then there's obviously big businesses versus small businesses. And then, of course, there's the wild card of Donald Trump. Who knows what he will do, how he will he stay on the reservation for this thing? Will he undercut what they're doing? We just, you know, we saw it in the ACA fight. He was not a help. And so our hope is that he will not be a help in the tax fight. So our core messages, and I apologize, I do not have updated talking points available. I hope to get those developed in the next 24 hours because we need to send them to the field, and once we do, we'll make them available to Public Leadership Institute. Core messages, top line, Trump GOP wants to give huge tax breaks to millionaires and wealthy corporations paid for by cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and education. The Trump GOP plan, as we said, it's massive tax cuts for the rich and wealthy. It's not tax reform. The tax reform, true tax reform, must require the wealthy corporations to pay their fair share. That means they must pay more. They must not get one penny in new tax cuts. They must pay their fair share to protect our priorities and to invest. And for those who are fact-oriented, that the wealthy will get a tax cut of $200,000 a year under these tax plans. And I'm just realizing I did not update this for our tax increases on the middle class, so we will fix that. These are signs that we have printed for folks around the country. They also say don't cut education and don't cut Social Security and don't cut Medicare. But you can see this is kind of how we're framing it. We win with this message, and so I really strongly urge you to incorporate. So here's some polling stuff. Polling a few slides on our poll from excuse me, June. One is top initial concerns. So we really pushed people. What do you care most about in this? When you think about the Trump GOP tax plan, what are the top concerns? And as you can see, most of the tax breaks for the wealthy and big corporations is on top with 54%. And these are like the biggest concerns. So this is not like, you know, if this was the only thing, it would be 70% if it was one of the only 2 or 3 choices. But this is spread out among a whole bunch of choices. And as you can see, the independent number there on the right-hand column, they're slightly higher than at 57%. And then the other big issue for them was tax cuts will be paid for because of healthcare and education, 51%. The core support, 27%, wasn't as strong. And as you can see, the independents, there was a 12-point gap between them on the tax cuts paid for message, the trade-offs message versus the fairness message up above. So they do not care that much about the deficit, the third bar there. They do care a lot about encouraging corporations to shift jobs and profits offshore, but it just didn't show up here compared to the other choices. And will not grow the economy and create jobs. That was not a concern for them. We found in our poll that about a third of the electorate believes the trickle-down theory, that tax breaks for the rich, tax breaks for corporations benefit average Americans, middle-class working Americans. Most do not. Our base does not believe that. And a lot of folks in the middle are very skeptical about it. Americans want corporations to pay their fair share. They probably feel more strongly about the corporation paying more than they do about the rich paying more. And they are also comfortable using the revenue for investments, not cutting tax rates. So the top bar is how much do they want. The question was, do you want to make sure wealthy corporations pay their fair share? 69 say yes, versus cutting taxes for businesses to make them more competitive in the global economy. That's the Republican message. So they better than a 2-to-1. We're creaming, our frame is creaming their frame on this. On the bottom, revenue from closing, how do you want to use the revenue from closing corporate tax loopholes and limiting deductions? Do you want to use it to invest, or do you want to use it to reduce tax rates on businesses? And you can see that is an astonishing margin. They are just not into cutting taxes on corporations and businesses. If you ask small businesses, they would be in favor of that. But if it's corporations, and we use the word businesses, it's not. They're not in favor of it at all. We tested different reasons to oppose it, kind of looking for some one-liners, what works best for you. And these were the 3 strongest, the top 3. Really there's one above all, which was that the trade-off. It's wrong for Congress to cut these programs. And at that time, Trump's budget was proposing cuts to Social Security, disability insurance. That's not in the Senate or the House plan anymore. But now we're saying cut Medicare, Medicaid, education, medical, to pay for tax breaks for the wealthy and corporations and the richest 2%. But then there's a huge fall off, not nearly as strong as the offshoring message. We should not give huge tax breaks to wealthy corporations, avoided taxes by session profits offshore. The next one, this plan of massive $5 trillion giveaway, mostly benefits billionaires. Again, not those 2 messages, which are good messages, didn't compare to this core message of linking cuts to services that people depend on to giving tax breaks to the wealthy and corporations. Just historical perspective, it used to be under Roosevelt, we had a 94% top tax rate. Under Nixon, it went to about 70%. How many years ago was that? Like 40 years ago, I guess. Reagan, it dropped down to 28%, popped back up to 39% under Clinton, and then Bush and Obama got it back up to 40%. And this, you remember how good the trickle down. This is the Bush tax cuts. And people celebrate, or sorry, the Reagan tax cuts way back in whenever it was, 1980, whatever. I'm forgetting my dates. Yeah, 81, 82. I'm confusing with the Bush tax cuts. Okay, just a few arguments against trickle down. Corporate profits are near record highs. They really are. I mean, unbelievably high. And corporate taxes are at record lows. It's like a Y. They used to be pretty much matched. Corporate taxes as a share of gross domestic product, which is how you want to measure this sort of stuff. They used to be about 50 years ago. They were both about 5 to 6% of gross domestic product. Now what you find is corporate profits are about 8 to 9% of gross domestic profits, and corporate taxes are at 2% of gross domestic profits, gross GDP. So just this huge yawning gap has erupted between how much corporations are paying as a share of the economy versus how much their profits are versus what they're paying in taxes. Tax cuts for the richer corporations create few jobs when you compare it to what investing in education, healthcare, and infrastructure pays. The numbers we have mostly date from Congressional Budget Office and Moody's. They date more from sort of recession time, responding to the 2008 recession. But like infrastructure, a buck spent on infrastructure is creating about 4 times as many jobs as a buck on tax cuts for the rich and corporations. So the buck on tax cuts and the corporations are actually losing money compared to what you get for on the bang for the buck on the spending side. Corporations are not overtaxed. Many don't pay their fair share now, or many don't pay anything. The Government Accountability Office did a study of corporate taxes from 2008 to 2012. That's a nonpartisan government entity. They said that the profitable corporations are paying a U.S. tax rate, effective tax rate of 14%, not the nominal bumper sticker tax rate of 35%, but less than half at 14%. Corporate taxes are not discouraging investments in job creation. Corporations are awash in profits. It's just that there's not the demand for them to build new factories or whatever. And then there's, of course, an example of Kansas, which you all are probably familiar with, being state and local legislators, about how they slash taxes, and you got huge, just slow growth and a budget crisis that went on for years, and then the Republican legislature actually overrode Brownback's veto, the governor's veto, for tax increases. Timeline we're in here, so it's really moving fast. The House of Representatives introduced a tax bill the week of October 30th. That's next week. Ways and Means Committee marks it up the week of November 6th, the week after. And then they want to put this thing on the floor of the House before Thanksgiving. The House can move faster, given its majorities and what have you. But the Senate operates a bit more in a little bit more of a bipartisan fashion. There's a tradition within the Senate Finance Committee, at least. We're expecting them to introduce a different tax bill. It will not be the same as the House the second week of November. They want to try and do a markup before Thanksgiving. They want to try and put it on the floor in December. We have no idea. I think that we are moving like this is a race, a fast race. My guess is that, like they had problems with the Affordable Care Act and the numbers weren't adding up and the numbers were disastrous for them, we're going to see that situation with their tax bill, and there's going to be a whole lot of back and forth between CBO and the House and Senate to try and get their numbers to add up right. But anyway, this is the schedule we're operating under. In the Senate, our targets are Tier 1 states to defeat the bill. We need 3 votes. Arizona McCain, he voted against the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, in part because he thought that they were too heavily skewed to the rich. So we are hopeful that he will see this, have the same concerns this time around. We do not know. Kentucky, Rand Paul has said he will vote against a tax bill that raises taxes on people. And so we are hoping he will stay true to his word. As I said, this raises taxes on a lot of middle-class people, so we're, kind of trying to keep him honest on it. Susan Collins, Maine, she cares about human people, and trade-offs, and so we're hopeful that we can get her on that. She also cares about middle-class tax cuts, not hurting the middle class. Tax increase. She cares about tax increase on the middle class. And then I talked about Corker and how he said he wants these things paid for. Tier 2 is really more about people who we think are important to say to the leadership, this thing is too expensive. There's too many middle-class folks are getting a tax increase. You got to shrink the size of the package. The smaller the package, the worse damage it'll do, even if it passes. And so Alaska, Ohio, and West Virginia, those are the senators, the states and the senators that are our targets there. And then 2018 Democrats, we're wondering how much is a concern. As you know, Trump's been courting a lot of these folks. We're working closely with the Democrats in the Senate to sort of figure out if we've got any problems there. In the House, our targets are members who voted against the Affordable Care Act repeal because they really care about people getting health care, and so they hopefully are susceptible to the tax trade-off argument. Members who are concerned about middle-class tax increases and SALT. There's a fair number of moderate Republicans, not even just moderate, swing people who are vulnerable in 2018 who have big middle-class tax increases, and then members concerned about their own reelection. Our action plan is on November 2nd, day of action. Next week we will do rapid response when the House, shortly, either 24 or 48 hours after the House plan is released. There will be local events. We will ask our activists to call their groups to call their members of Congress. So hopefully people are in touch with you, asking you to participate in these sorts of things. If not, reach out to who you think should be doing this sort of work. And if they're not doing it, say, hey, get involved. We need to swing in action. November 9th, day of action, we will probably be doing stuff that week, that Thursday, focusing on corporate offshore tax dodging. Obviously, ongoing protests at town halls, other media events, social media. We put out a lot of social media stuff. A lot of it is focused on, Republicans taking bad votes, Are you on the side of the middle class or not? That sort of stuff. All of these things are, look for AmericansForTaxFairness.org is our website. From there you can get linked to our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is the number 4, Tax Fairness. And Twitter, gosh, I think it's Americans for Tax Fairness. But again, you can get it off of our website. We also are running we're doing special targeted work in the Senate swing Tier 1 and 2 states, and then we have a StopTrumpTaxCuts.org website, which has got more of an activist-oriented website, less thinky-tanky or less. It's a different version. It's more cutting edge, and there's more tools there for taking action. And then I'll stop there.
Great. I mean, Frank, that's a lot of information, and I think you nicely rolled out the game plan from not even just from like an organizing strategy, but laying out the message frames. That's compelling. I mean, the thing that I guess I'm going to start it off, and again, anyone should feel free to type questions in the question bar. Please. Make sure you download the handouts that are attached to your control panel. A lot of the information that Frank covered is captured in there. The last link that I sent, the earlier links were the hyperlinks that he referenced in the presentation, and the last link was a state-by-state comparison, the impact specifically to all 50 states, and a link to all of those reports is available for anyone to, and you should see that in your chat bar. But I mean, coming to this broad conversation, all the polling gets reported. Overwhelmingly, people believe that this plan is going to disproportionately benefit the rich and corporations over themselves. So we start from that general frame. I am interested, and based on your conversations, those who are sensitive to the political realities of that. What are members of Congress or others? I mean, going into a 2018 election cycle, what are they thinking?
Well, as I said, the Republicans are freaking out that if they don't deliver on tax cuts, then all will be lost for them. I think Democrats, it really varies. You've got a lot. You have some Democrats, more on the progressive caucus side of things who, the Republicans have helped things by basically being so partisan with this. They've not constructed this as a deal, the big tax breaks in the past, whether it was the Bush tax cuts or the Reagan tax cuts or the '86 tax reform that truly was tax reform, it was revenue neutral. Those were all done in two parties together, or if not together, at least they had Democratic votes. It wasn't done through reconciliation. In my estimation, mistakenly, Democrats supported Reagan and Bush tax cuts, which has dug us into this huge hole we're in, deficit-wise now. I think the Republican, the way they're proceeding is splitting Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. But there are a fair number of, what I call moderate Democrats, whether they're up for re-election or not, who strongly believe in, aren't true believers in terms of corporations paying their fair share. They want to give them a break. And so, it's not monolithic.
Right. We got a couple of questions we're asking, can we get these slides and all this information? And absolutely, we can make the slideshow available for everybody. And again, a lot of the information is captured in all those handouts that are attached to this presentation. So you just have to click on it, and you can download the PDF, and we can get that. Next, Mindy's asking the question, who are the moderate Dems that aren't on board? And I assume it means aren't on board.
Well, at this point, as I say, because of the partisan nature, the Republicans are trying to get this thing passed through the reconciliation process, which allows them to only pass it with 51 votes in the Senate. Virtually all the Democrats are saying, forget it. I'm not going to play with you on this. if they were trying to do majority rule where they needed the Democratic votes, then they would work and try and negotiate some sort of a deal. But right now, I'm hopeful that people like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, McCaskill in Missouri, Tester in Montana, Heitkamp in North Dakota, that those folks, Casey in Pennsylvania, that they're going to stay strong, that they're not going to play with Trump because the core, they understand the core of this program is a huge benefit to the rich and corporations, and they know that the Democratic base would not forgive them if they voted for that, or even negotiate with Trump over making it slightly better.
Right. I mean, the thing for me that continues to be, almost mind-numbing is, that not only the way this all works out, playing with the rates and a measured tax increase on middle-class families, but particularly how it, going after SALT and other types of things that are wildly popular tax credits and tax deductions that people enjoy. And I think from the point of rollout, I think the public response has been like, what are you thinking? And it definitely does create this galvanizing opportunity for not just your federal public policy leaders, but your state and local leaders to be weighing in on this fight because of what it means for their particular residents. So can you speak to a little bit like the organizing? I mean, you made reference to some of the studies and some of the reports that help drive some of the work at Americans for Tax Fairness. Do you sense that these, coalition of local, state, and governments that are coming together to organize effectively around this, or are we still waiting to see where things go?
No, they've got a very they've got an ambitious, a strong program. They've got major players in there that are not seen as partisan. The counties, the GFOA, mayors, people from towns. So it's potent. It's a potent issue. It's a lot of money, and I'm very. They will not fully repeal SALT. I think the question is, are they going to curb it back? And how much money does that raise, and how much does that help them get over the top in terms of paying for their tax cuts? This is a fine. They need to raise money from this tax deduction because they need to raise money to not have the deficit too big. So they're in a bind, and if they cut the SALT deduction in half, that means they get, say, $600 billion, but they're short another $600 billion. So it means that they have to then figure out, well, am I going to get that up? I'm going to make that up from closing some other tax deduction or loophole or break, or am I going to shrink the size of the package? And then who's going to get less? Mm-hmm. It's all a balancing act.
Right. We got a question here from, John. Does public support for this tax cut action for the rich, does it vary much state by state? So across the board, people are not happy about the idea of corporations and the rich benefiting from all of this. Is there variation, significant variation state by state? And so maybe like red state, blue state comparison, economic brackets. Can you speak to maybe some of the variations?
Yeah, the challenges are sample. When you do 1,000-person sample, and your sample in each state is just not big enough to be able to make those sorts of determinations. Mm-hmm. Now we actually have a poll coming out, might be in a week or so, where it's a 1,500-person sample, and it's in 15 states. They're battleground states, so we're getting a 100-person sample in those states. That's still a margin of error, 10 points.
Right.
So our ability to, that's not terribly reliable, and you really have to do the same poll in, of 400 to 500 or 600 voters in 10 states to make that kind of a comparison. I think what my pollsters would say is that the profile of the voters is the same. It doesn't really matter that much where they're from. If they're a independent voter, they're kind of pretty consistent from, Michigan to Alabama. And so I think that the geography is less important. It's more the ideology or the persuasion of the voter.
Mm-hmm. Would you, to policy leaders, we've got staff from state legislators around the country on the call, local leaders, what would be the best thing that they can do to lend their support to this fight?
The most important thing is to, right now, it would be to organize a news conference on November 2nd, Thursday, November 2nd, with local elected officials, with, the leader of a human social service organization, a small business person who can say they're not going to get a tax break out of this. I mean, with constituencies that can basically testify to the media and say, the tax plan that's now just been released in the House, and I'm guessing they have said they're going to release it next week, and so we're doing this event on Thursday in the anticipation they'll release it on Tuesday or Wednesday, to say that this tax plan is no different than what they've proposed before. It's massive tax cuts for the rich and corporations, paid for by cutting Medicare, Medicaid, education, etc. And we will have a whole package of materials for that. The groups we work with, the AFL-CIO, they're at actually a convention right now. They're going to be much more active on the week of the 6th. But AFSCME next week, Move On, Organizing for America, Healthcare for America Now, groups that have networks. They've got groups in 40, 50 cities. They will do press events on the 2nd. We'll do another series of press events. The AFL will come on, and Indivisible will come on the week of the 6th. So we're going to sort of do waves of these sorts of things.
And if people wanted to get some of those materials, where do they go again?
Why don't you feel free to email me, FCLEMENTE at americansfortaxfairness.org, and I will pass you to my field folks. F. Clemente, CLEMENTE at Americans, the word FOR, taxfairness.org.
Okay, I put that email out and sent it around to the pool. So that, and it's a resource that that people should be, calling in, plugging in. This is about really raising the national profile of this topic and presenting it, in the issue frame that Frank laid out in the presentation today. All right, got another question. Mindy's asking another question here. Do you have any numbers for return on investment on dollars spent on Medicare, Medicaid, and education? And again, she's asking this, is that by limiting these dollars, this has a long-term economic impact on our communities?
Mm-hmm. I'm racking my brain. Do I know anybody who's done that sort of work? I know I don't. The return on investment on, a buck spent on infrastructure, we have those numbers. I don't have it on the economic.
A lot of the groups that I know, that a lot of groups that were involved in the ACA, defense. So a lot of the the human service provider organization coalitions in states, they have a lot of that. Particularly in a state that had Medicaid expansion, they were able to roll out the dollars that were flowing to communities, and were able to break it down by counties and even sometimes more local than that. So I think that would be another place for that information. But I think it's also a good point. I mean, it's like this doesn't have just a crippling effect on, putting an increased tax burden on middle-class families. This has an impact and an effect on harming the economic framework in our respective communities. I mean, the idea that this is going to result in a massive economic gain is foolhardy. I mean, it's the years of the 80s seem to have passed us by.
Yeah, we have a lot of trickle-down experience.
I know.
I'm sure you have it in your states too.
Absolutely. Well, I'm based in Michigan, and so we see it. Firsthand. It is definitely. The rhetoric, even though it mirrors that of the advocacy of trickle-down policy. From the president to others talking about tax reform, absolutely critical of moving our economy, to improving our economy. This really is one of these situations in which very wealthy corporations, very wealthy billionaires with a particular agenda are trying to push this, and in seemingly every way possible, trying to make the case how absolutely critical this is for America. And again, from the polling and the research, people aren't buying it. And I guess at what point do we juxtapose? So I feel like we're spending a lot of time, particularly on the progressive side, a lot of time in defense. And we got to try to make certain that bad tax policy, that effort that is being proposed doesn't become reality. But at what point do we pivot to this conversation about why this should be such a greater conversation about investing in the core things to build America, invest in America, and invest in people? Where is the proactive legislative fight that should meet up against this with the same level of intensity as pushing? And I realize where we are in history, but it seems like long term, if we aren't able to meet this type of political force with the same type of ferocity that they're pushing behind this, we're constantly finding ourselves on the merry-go-round trying to litigate a claim that, well, facts have borne out already, but they're still going to, political influence is still going to try to push them.
Well, I preach this all the time. If you look at the Republicans, tax cuts are that and small government are two sides of the same coin, but that's the foundation for them. And
right.
Until our side gets religion on this, gives sufficient emphasis to it, we will always be playing defense. Now, the reality is we have the public does not trust Washington, and they do not trust politicians. They trust local politicians more than they trust Washington politicians, but still they have real problems, huge problems with Washington. The system's rigged, and I maintain that the thing that people feel is most rigged about Washington is the tax system. And so part of it is sort of solving how people feel about their elected officials and about whether Washington delivers good things or not. But unless we are talking about that you have to pay for these things, if you want to have secure retirement, if you want to send your kids to college, et cetera, and it requires raising taxes. For too long, Democrats ran away from the idea of raising taxes. It is a winning electoral issue now for Democrats. You can win on the tax fairness issue. You can at least win the debate with your Republicans in the minds of the public. Now, whether that wins you an election or not is different. But as an issue that's debated in the election, you win if you say you're for make sure the rich corporations pay their fair share. My opponent is for giving them huge tax cuts. I want them to pay that we can, make sure you got a secure retirement, et cetera. That's a winning message. It's not a losing message, and the Republicans know it now, and not enough Democrats are running on it.
Wow. That's right. Well, and I'm curious in this, even in the fight that's before us, and so where I mean the greatest attention is going to be given to Democratic legislators, I mean in Congress and particularly in the Senate, to what the message would be so absolutely key. But even as this conversation is going forward, like are we putting forth alternative strategies? Are we putting forth alternative proposals about what we should be doing while they are?
No,
I mean, obviously,
I'm not worried about that right now. We need to do all we can to have everybody manning the barricades to block this thing. We are so close to losing that everybody's got to be engaged here in defense, not worry about off. We don't need offense, an offensive message as in, oh, let's raise taxes on the rich and corporations. We just need to play defense here.
If, again, we have a few extra people who've just joined us. We've been talking about what the Trump tax plan means to you, to our local communities. We talked through a number of the best messages and how to push back against them. There are an array of handouts that, thanks to Frank and his team at Americans for Tax Fairness, that is attached to your control panel, which I encourage you before the end of this presentation that you download, as well as some hyperlinks to reports and research and other information, particularly state-by-state analysis of what these tax cuts, this tax cut proposal actually does, and the harm that it actually could cause in your states and local communities. So I encourage you to pull on all that to and really claim a space in, pushing back against these things. Frank also talked about the national second call to action. Bring that, help add your voice to the national pushback against this approach of awarding massive tax giveaways to corporations, the wealthiest people in this country, all paid for on the backs of middle class and low income Americans. If you have any additional information or any questions, type your question in the question bar or raise your hand. But we went through a lot of information here, and I'm not seeing any more questions coming through. But if folks have any, we'll give you a couple more minutes, a couple more seconds to type them in.
I kind of need to get going, Dave, if there's no more questions.
Okay. There we go. Okay. There we go. When the host needs the main presenter. We gotta go. Frank, I know you're incredibly busy. Thank you for adjusting your schedule to be with us here today. This has been incredibly rewarding. We will make sure the slideshow presentation gets available to everybody. And Frank, I'll give you the kind of the closing words of where we go from here.
We go to win.
We go to win.
We can win it. Just believe we can win it. So we can win the narrative on this thing, which helps in the future, but I think we can win the substance too. The other side's very afraid, and we've got a lot of tools to work with. So let's
with blood in the water, it's our time to strike. So thank you, Frank. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can join us on this more Public Leadership Institute presentations every 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to leave the presentation up for a few moments, even though I will probably go offline, so that if you haven't download all the documents and put them to good use. Until next time, everyone. Bye-bye.